as a superlative evangelist. Listen to this. Evangelism is the elixir that warms up cold churches, the force that moves the members from standing on the premises to standing on the promises. He conducted successful tent meetings both in the cities in which he pastored and as a guest evangelist in other conferences. His rule was, don't ask anybody for permission, just put up your tent and start preaching. I wonder if we could still do that now. Yearly, Brooks had either the highest or was in the top 3 in persons baptized in his conference. In the summer of 1961 alone, CD baptized 179, putting the membership of Glenville above 1,000. In his final evangelistic series in Cleveland, Brooks baptized 108 persons. In 1963, Neil Wilson, president of the Columbia Union Conference, invited CD to be the field secretary of the union. He promised to do that job as long as he could keep evangelistic meetings. That was his stipulation about taking the position. He was field secretary for 2 years and ministerial secretary from 1966 to 1971. He toured the union, speaking, preaching, training ministers, and doing evangelism, which is what he enjoyed doing. He made that stipulation. He did so, including, he also ran evangelistic meetings in places such as Philadelphia in 1964, New York in 1966, and Egypt in 1967. In 1971, General Conference President Robert Pearson called CD to be field secretary of the World Church. He represented the church far and wide around the world. In a crusade in Jamaica in 1972, CD baptized more than 500, and the next year in Chicago, 243. And as I mentioned earlier, he also had evangelistic meetings in the island of Antigua. Many churches were raised up. Listeners of all races, nationalities, ages, and backgrounds were captivated by Brooks's powerful, earnest, riveting, and eloquent, truth-filled sermons. Cassette tapes featuring his sermons were produced by the thousands. In 1974, Walter Artis, a Seventh-day Adventist media personality, convinced CD to become speaker director for a new television ministry that he had founded called Breath of Life. Even though he preferred speaking to live audiences, Brooks agreed with the idea. He realized that he could actually reach more souls this way than preaching in person in tents and halls. He was still full-time field secretary at the time, and several times a year he would record for Breath of Life in the studios at the Adventist Media Center in Thousand Oaks, California. Breath of Life was the first Black religious television program. It was a General Conference ministry that was funded by the church as well as offerings and donations. The early production team consisted of Walter Artis and Message magazine editor at the time, Louis B. Reynolds, with gifted musical groups such as the Breath of Life Quartet, and features from Wintley Phipps, Yolanda Innocent Palmer, Eleanor Wright, and T. Marshall Kelly. As Speaker Director of Breath of Life, Brooks took his place among the legendary Adventist media trailblazers such as HMS Richards, George Vanderbilt, and William Fagel. A second wave of Adventist televangelists included Dan Matthews, Dwight Nelson, Mark Finley, Lana Melishenko, Walter Pearson, and Doug Batchelor followed in their footsteps. In 1989, Breath of Life aired on Black Entertainment Television, potentially reaching 90 million people per week in the United States and the Caribbean. C.D. Brooks' messages were also distributed by VHS. The younger ones probably won't know what that is. And later, CDs and DVDs. In fact, today you can also see them on YouTube. Brooks was Speaker Director of Breath of Life Ministries for 23 years, from 1974 to 1997. During that time, the ministry brought approximately 15,000 people to Christ, established 15 Breath of Life congregations, and was viewed by untold millions. Significantly, CD was a leading evangelist of the global church during the unprecedented years of soul winning in the 1980s and 1990s. He also received many singular honors during those years. He spoke at President Ronald Reagan's religious inaugural celebration in 1981. He spoke at several General Conference sessions. He also received an honorary doctorate from Andrews University in 1985 and was asked to serve as General Conference Vice President in 1985. In 1989, he was featured on the Christ of the Narrow Way painting by Alfred Lee, commissioned by the Ellen G. White Estate. In 1994, he was inducted into the Martin Luther King Jr. Board of Preachers and Collegium of Scholars at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. And he also graced the Founders Wall of the Adventist Media Center. In 1995, Brooks participated in NET 95, the largest and most extensive evangelistic program in Seventh-day Adventist history up to that time. Brooks' last meeting as Breath of Life speaker was in March and April of 1995 in Phoenix, Arizona. On June 10, 1995, shortly after conducting a sermon at the South Central Camp Meeting on the campus of Oakwood University, C.D. Brooks had a heart attack. On January 1, 1996, because of his medical problems, he officially retired as General Conference Field Secretary. He was the longest to hold that position. He also retired as Speaker Director of Breath of Life in the spring of 1997. He was honored with various ceremonies at the General Conference and other venues. There are many other things that I could say about Pastor C.D. Brooks, but time will not permit. During his retirement, he was still as busy as when he was working. In early 2016, C.D. was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He died on the morning of June 5, 2016, at age 85. He was survived by his wife of 64 years, 2 children, and 3 grandchildren. His was a life well lived. He was a very busy person. What about us? What are we doing for Christ? We might not be evangelists, but in our own little area, we can do our part to proclaim the Lord, not just as preachers, but our lives should show that we have been with Christ. Amen. Okay, at this time we're going to separate for classes. Do we have any visitors today? Okay, welcome if you're a visitor. We have classes. There's a class that meets here in the sanctuary. There are classes that meet through both of these doors. And there's one that meets over there in the corner, over there beside, in the alcove. Thank you. So, as we study the life of Daniel and the way he helped Nebuchadnezzar, let us remember that it's important for us to live up to the light that we know. We never know where we'll be able to help people depending on where they are. So let's separate for classes at this time.